Okay, thanks a lot. John Saul, a fellow Canadian revolutionary and scholar of sub-Saharan Africa, used to tell an anecdote that I like about his time teaching politics and sociology for over a decade in different countries of sub-Saharan Africa. He used to describe researchers from North America, well-intentioned Marxist researchers from North America or Europe coming down, and he would say that if they spent 2 weeks there, they would confidently go away and publish a book on the country, and if they spent 6 months there, they were able to produce perhaps an article, and if they spent 2 years there, they were so debilitated they didn't know what the fuck was going on. So, after 12 years of revisiting Bolivia, this promises to be a highly confused summary of my take on the matter over the last 12 years or so, but I'll do my best. So the place to start is to say that in the opening years of the 21st century, Bolivia, I think uncontroversially, was at the cutting edge of a much wider resurgence of resistance to neoliberalism in Latin America that was going on, and that Latin America, in the opening years of the 21st century, prior to the more recent Arab Spring, was the region of the world most militantly opposing the neoliberal phase of global capitalism as it was unfolding unevenly across the world. So in the Bolivian case in particular, you saw a left indigenous cycle of revolt rise up without recent precedent in the country in terms of depth and intensity, capable of overthrowing 2 neoliberal presidents in under 2 years. So Gonzalez de Lozada was overthrown in October 2003, followed by Carlos Mesa only 14 months later in June 2005. And all of this laid the basis for the successful bid by Evo Morales to become the country's first indigenous president as leader of the Movimiento al Socialismo, or Movement Towards Socialism party. In December 2005, in those elections, and then 4 years later to be re-elected with an unprecedented 64% of the popular vote in December 2009. So all of this was going on in a country where still close to 70% of the population at the time of Morales' first election was identified as being below the poverty line even by official statistics, and where in the latest census that we have in 2001, 62% of the population self-identified as indigenous, and a country in which racial oppression and class exploitation have been inextricably intertwined since the Spanish period of colonialism, and also in different form through the internally colonial race relations established after the founding of the Republic in 1825 and the transition toward a tin-based and then subsequently silver and subsequently natural gas-based commodity capitalism. So it's always important to start out with the idea that the form in which capitalism was constituted in the Bolivian social formation was always highly racialized. Another thing, before I get into the details of the current period to understand, obviously in a very cursory way, is to chart out and to have in the back of your mind the 2 predominant traditions of popular cultures of opposition and resistance in what became Bolivia over the course of a number of centuries. One of those currents, obviously very eclectic with different strands and so on that I can't get into, are different forms of indigenous rebellion, stretching back at least to the massive 1781 revolt against the Spanish conquistadores, led by a person named Tupac Katari, who was drawn and quartered by the Spanish, meaning He had each of his 4 limbs tied to 4 different horses that were set off into different directions, pulling him apart. And what he said famously before that event occurred was that he was one man, but that he would return as millions. And it may seem odd to reference 1781 in a talk about the 21st century, but his name is very, very alive in the indigenous movement today, with movements called the Cateristas and so on, and many of whom see themselves as the embodiment of his return in the millions through this left indigenous insurrection. Now, the other tradition is a more recent phenomenon having to do with the transition from silver capitalism to tin capitalism in the early 20th century of Bolivia. And what you saw there, for a bunch of reasons that I'm not going to go into any depth, is the formation of the most militant revolutionary labor movement in all of Latin America, driven uniquely by Trotskyist and anarcho-syndicalist currents rather than Stalinist communist currents that held sway, or left populist currents that held sway in different countries of the region for most of the 20th century. Now, these two traditions, revolutionary Marxism imbued with also currents of anarcho-syndicalism in the tin mines, and these traditions of indigenous radicalism did not always easily coincide or come together in powerful ways. But if you look at the last several centuries of popular resistance, both to the way in which the state was formed in Bolivia and the way in which capitalism developed, those moments in which these traditions were able to come together in defense of their combined interests were those moments in which both capitalism and the state in its capitalist form were most seriously challenged. And one of the principal arguments of what I call combined liberation struggle is the way in which, once again, in the 2000 to 2005 period, you saw this unique combination of revolutionary Marxist traditions coalescing in very unique ways with traditions of indigenous liberation against internally colonial race relations. So against that very introductory backdrop, what I'm going to try to accomplish today is to periodize and characterize the 3 principal periods that I think are most important in terms of understanding the current conjuncture in Bolivian politics. The first occurs between 1985 and 2000, and it's a period that I want to call the Orthodox Neoliberal period, followed by a period between 2000 and 2005, which is one of a revolutionary epic, and then a period from 2006, that is to say when Morales came into office, until the present, as a period of revolutionary containment, and more controversially, the establishment of reconstituted neoliberalism. I'm going to spend most of the time on the first 2 periods and then just give some sketchy remarks on the contemporary period, because I think people know more about that, but I'm happy to return to it in the Q&A. Now, in 1985, you had, at the end of a hyperinflationary crisis of unparalleled intensity in the Latin American region, in Bolivia, you had the assumption of office of the first neoliberal coalition in the country. And it instituted the beginning of a 15-year right-wing advance that was, by and large, uncontested successfully. Obviously there were all kinds of localized resistances to this advance, but none of it countered the weight of right-wing advance for the next 15 years. And I want to argue that Bolivia was the most severe laboratory of neoliberal economic restructuring in the entire South American region, which is to say that no other country conformed to the basic precepts of Washington Consensus to the extent that the Bolivian regime established in '85 was able to accomplish. And the beginning of that period, the most important and decisive moment that allowed for that 15-year advance of neoliberal restructuring was the defeat of the tin miners. The defeat in its most important 20th century form of revolutionary Marxist organization in the country. There was a privatization of the tin mines, and 30,000 miners, 90% of the mining workforce, lost their jobs and were, in the euphemistic terms of the government of the time, relocated to the slums of the urban shanty towns around the capital and other major cities of the country. And it took them over 15 years to become capable of organizing new forms of resistance within a radically new world of work, the informal economies on the peripheries of the capital city and other cities. But what was also important was a very particular kind of repeasantization of some of these miners. Some of these miners had previously been peasants, indigenous peasants who were proletarianized into the mines. Others had never been peasants, but had lived their entire lives inside the mines. But in response to a basic precept of neoliberalism, the pursuit of comparative advantage, which says that countries should focus on the production of commodities that they can sell at the dearest price on the international market and produce most cheaply. The commodity of choice in this day was coca for the production of cocaine, which was a very high-priced commodity in the international market at the time. And with the geography of Bolivia, it was one of the most capable production centers of coca for cocaine. Now, as a side note, it's important to say that coca has many other traditional uses in Bolivia, but we shouldn't avoid the basic fact that the coca produced in the Chapare region, where most of this repeasantization of miners occurred, was for the international cocaine market. Although Bolivia was always at the bottom rung of this commodity chain, most of the production into actual cocaine happening later on in Colombia and Peru on its way to the American market. Now, what happened in this repeasantization was that although it was very predictable, and although U.S. imperialism was supportive, obviously, of the transition to neoliberalism in the country, they were simultaneously introducing the most rigorous initial stages of their so-called war on drugs, which meant a militarization of precisely the region that was being repeasantized, which created a very unique kind of small-holding illegal peasantry that was militantly anti-imperialist and constantly in military confrontations with the Drug Enforcement Agency, the different agents of the U.S. state, and then Bolivian police and military inside of that milieu. And it was out of this zone that Evo Morales emerges first as a political figure. He was an Aymara indigenous teenager when his family suffered the crisis of the tin mining production of the Western Highlands and moved after a temporary period in Argentina into the Chapare region, where he, from the age of 14, became a cocolero or a coca grower in this period. And he rose up the ranks to become the first union leader and to become the first leader of what was then the Movimiento al Socialismo, the movement towards socialism party, by the end of the 1990s. Which at its beginning, and I'll say more about this in the concluding part of the talk, was at the beginning in this period, mid-90s to late 90s, the movement towards socialism party was basically centered in the cocalero peasantry with a extra parliamentary focus on confrontation with the state and participation in elections only as a means of providing a platform for its ideological presentation to a wider audience, but had no pretense of becoming, at that stage, a party that could contest national elections. So there's much more to say, but those are the basic changes of class structure and of organizational structure of the left that's important to understand. The defeat of the tin miners and the rise of the cocalero movement. And while the cocalero movement was a heroic anti-imperialist and anti-neoliberal movement at the time, it had nothing of the social weight or capability of shutting down the economy in the way that the miners had over the entire preceding period of the 20th century. Because although they represented only ever 10% of the economically active population, they were the entire source of foreign exchange in the country, and when they shut down the mines, they shut down everything that was the Bolivian economy. So shifting, how are we doing for time? 10 minutes, okay. So I'm going to go more rapidly through the next two phases. Beginning in 1998 and extending to 2002, South America as a whole entered into its deepest recession since the early 1980s debt crisis. And in Bolivia, this resulted in eventually what I want to argue was a severe crisis of the state by the year 2000, and the opening up of the first rearticulation of left indigenous opposition to that project, and eventually a revolutionary epic that we can see extending from 2000 to 2005. So inside, we have the Asian financial crisis of 1997, the Russian crisis of 1998, and all kinds of regional crises happening that eventually find their constitution in the Latin American case through a crisis in Brazil, and most significantly a crisis in Argentina, which reached its epical height in 2001. Now, the principal export markets at the time for all of Bolivian commodities, but particularly natural gas, were both the Brazilian markets and the Argentinian markets. But not only that, Bolivia being a much, much poorer country was a supplier and exporter of massive amounts of migrant labor into the worst sectors of the labor market in both the major cities of Brazil and even more prominently in Argentina. So as Brazil and Argentina enter into crisis, this ricochets back into Bolivia in particular forms, and you also see a return of huge numbers of migrant laborers, which pumps up an already high level of unemployment. And so after 15 years of neoliberal right-wing restructuring, with its concomitant destruction of the very small welfare state that had existed in Bolivia until that period, increasing rates of poverty and inequality throughout that period, high rates of unemployment, with all the promises of the idea that trade liberalization, financial liberalization, and so on would provide short-term pain but long-term gain in the rising tide of all boats as the economy grew, as that ideological veneer was already suffering after 15 years of failing to come to fruition. When the entire South American bloc falls into a severe recession between 98 and 2002, the ideological sustainability of neoliberalism in the country, in that region, falls apart in a way that was much more dramatic than anywhere else in the world at that moment. And in Bolivia, the answer of the ruling class, in particular Hugo Banzer, the president at the time, was to ramp up the neoliberal project that had already been introduced. And this took the form in the most explosive way in the privatization of water in the city of Cochabamba in 2000. And what this meant was a 300% tariff increase on basic access to water inside of the potable water area of the city, and in addition, access of poor peasants to wells and so on were now being charged exorbitant fees to wells that they themselves had built that were handed over to Bechtel over this period. This laid the basis, or was the spark, for an already rearticulating movement inside of the city of Cochabamba, and led to the famous Cochabamba water war under the leadership of the shoe factory worker Oscar Oliveira and the Federation of Factory Workers that was at the center of that movement. So what you see then is both the beginning of a crisis of the state from above in the way in which the economic crisis starts to be mediated through elections inside of Bolivia with the decomposition of the three main right-wing parties, the MNR, the ADN, and the MIR that had introduced Bolivian neoliberalism over the preceding 15 years. They start to radically decompose and be unable to contest seriously in the elections in the way that they had previously. Meaning that by 2002, what had been a very marginal extra-parliamentary party, the movement towards socialism, came within 1% of winning the most votes in the 2002 elections, which set the party on course to thinking about more and more orienting toward an electoral contestation of office rather than building extra-parliamentary forms of power as their preeminent focus. Now, the 2000 gas war, or 2000 water war, then extends over 5 years into a wave of rural and urban popular insurrections, with, by 2003, the capital city of La Paz and its neighboring shantytown of El Alto being literally shut down for a period of 3 weeks, with the major demand of the nationalization of natural gas, the most important commodity in the country, and the establishment of a constituent assembly to remake the state, society, and economy according to some currents, and at least an anti-neoliberal line, and to predominant currents in the west part of the country, an anti-capitalist reconstruction of Bolivia. And so in 2003, that mobilization allowed for the expulsion of the most hated president in the 20th century, Gonzalez de Lozada, but there was no alternative in which to replace him once he was ousted from power. And the constitutional exit to that crisis was the assumption to office of Sanchez de Lozada's vice president, Carlos Mesa. And what you see is a transformation of the movement towards socialism party over this period in its class composition, programmatic character, beginning with the 2002 elections in which they almost won. You see a shift from a small peasant anti-imperialist movement toward an increasingly urban middle class movement with huge sections of opportunists from the declining neoliberal parties joining what was the ascendant party of the movement towards socialism. And in the 2003-2005 gas wars, the party itself, the leadership of the party played virtually no role in the mobilization of those two critical moments in the contestation of the neoliberal project, but rather were essential in negotiating an exit in which elections were moved forward and elections became the principal focus of events. And once Morales comes to office after winning the December 2005 elections, what I argue was a combined liberation struggle, that is, a struggle both for indigenous liberation and a struggle against capitalist class oppression, particularly in its neoliberal form, became a distinct struggle of stages, most clearly articulated in the theoretical formulations of the vice president and one of the most important Marxist theoreticians that Bolivia has produced, Álvaro García Linera, who said that the project of the moment towards socialism was now what he called Andean-Amazonian capitalism, that is to say, a capitalism that will somehow be benevolent to indigenous peoples and allow for what he called a democratic cultural revolution to happen today with a capitalist transition from capitalism to socialism sometime in the distant future, 50 to 100 years. So what you see then is effectively, over the course of the next 6 years, the rearticulation of right-wing autonomous movements in the eastern lowlands who had been effectively defeated between 2000 and 2005, but who the government of Morales allowed to enter into negotiations once they entered into office in 2005. It was their first step to allow for subsidies towards the major soya agro-industrialist producers of the eastern lowlands to ensure that mostly Brazilian foreign capital would be respected, and to acknowledge that all foreign capital in the country would have its rights respected so long as they entered into what they call partnerships with the state rather than becoming the bosses of the state. So I think I'm running out of time, but I want to end just with something I've talked about in two issues ago in International Socialism, and then with a response to a criticism of the article in the forthcoming International Socialism, which is the Tipnis conflict, which I think synthesizes many of the contradictions that we see unfolding inside of Bolivia today. On the one side, you have those on the international left who are arguing that we have uncritical support of a project to build a major highway through indigenous territories inside of the Amazon, of the Tipnis, in order to allow for Brazilian capital to have a route of exports through Bolivia to reach the Pacific coast, and subsequently the Asian markets. People like Federico Fuentes, most importantly, but others have argued that this is a project that is necessary for and all that we can expect of a left government in the current period, a better regulation of capitalism. And then there are those who say, such as myself, who argue that we need to be much more subtle in our understanding of whose side we're on. That is to say, placing emphasis on solidarity with the oppressed and exploited immediately themselves, rather than governments that purportedly act in their name, particularly in cases in which the government is sending in the coercive apparatuses of the state to dislodge and dispossess in the interest of Brazilian capital an indigenous self-governing territory, while cynically employing a ideology of indigenous liberation in its international forums of the Mother Earth, Pachamama, and so on, which Morales does on a regular basis. So there's much more to say, but I'll leave my time to talk.
Thanks, Jeff. Just to acknowledge and say how very important it is that you write as you do, and that your contribution to this debate about Bolivia. And yeah, I will pick you up from Tipnis, but maybe what I'd like to start with is just a snapshot of the present moment. If we look at the left's governments of Latin America, we've heard about Bolivia, and let's take Tipnis as a typical example. There are many others, which is that the government is restraining, restricting, and increasingly, in a number of cases, repressing revolts from below. And Garcia Linero, who Jeff just mentioned, who's a very important analyst and writer about Latin America, has just produced a very new book in which he argues, using the language and the concepts of Marxism, he argues that really the state is now coexisted with the people. It is the same. And therefore, when the state acts, it acts on behalf of the people as a whole, rather than individual sections of it, and this is something people have to come to understand. I mean, to be fair to him, he's a little more subtle in his arguments than that, but he had more than 25 minutes. So, to move from there to Ecuador, for example, where Rafael Correa is another central presidential figure in ALBA and the other, and now CELAC and the other Latin American organs of Latin American integration, encouraged and fostered by Venezuela and the Bolivarian alliance. Correa very recently produced a new law in the parliament which is absolutely shocking, which criminalizes all form of public resistance. Now, there have been over the last year, 6 months in particular, major confrontations between the indigenous organizations, CONAI and Ecuador, the major indigenous organizations, over the question of mining, oil exploration, and fundamentally and centrally about water and the diversion of water away from communities and towards mines and industry. He has now criminalized it and denounced those who lead these movements as terrorists. There are 15 injunctions out for the main leaders of these movements who are described as counter-revolutionaries and terrorists and so on. And now let's move just very briefly to Venezuela. Obviously it's a huge discussion, but just to say on the 7th of October there will be an election a presidential election in Venezuela, which the two main candidates are Gabriel Rodonsky, entirely familiar looking. He's the kind of guy you think you've seen dozens of times before in various right-wing and business gatherings from New York to London and beyond. And a right-wing coalition around him. The other candidate is Hugo Chavez, who will undoubtedly win. I know it's dangerous. I'm going to get a lot of egg on my face if I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. He's 20 points ahead in the polls. He has mass popular support, and I think he will win. But what will his victory mean? And I think this is it's a very vexed and very contested area, but what will Chavez's victory mean? It will be announced and declared as a victory for Poder Popular, for the power of the people. And his ministries are called Ministries for People's Power. But in fact, for most of the people, for the grassroots who will vote for Chavez and support him, it will certainly not be a victory for them, and it will certainly not express itself in a deepening of their struggles and an extension of their control over the productive process, over community resources and the like. On the contrary, it will be a victory, and one other dimension is that Chavez is extremely ill, and the likelihood is that he will not be with us much longer, and the successors are already named and known, and they belong to a small, tight, extremely corrupt state bureaucracy which Chavez has built around himself, and which now control the economy, the political life of the country, and so on. There is no level of popular mobilization independently of mobilizing support for Chavez, who, if you look at the election propaganda, has now become the single subject of Venezuelan history. Now, just leaving it there, and there will be discussion later. If we look at Bolivia, and look at Ecuador, and we look at Venezuela, what they have in common, and I'm not even going to mention the odious and disgusting Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, who got to power by making an alliance with the person who had attacked him, the Sandinista government for 11 years, Obando y Bravo. But leaving that aside, all of these governments were carried to power by the mass movements from below that Jeff has described and that we have described in the past. They were brought to power in the context of the collapse and decomposition of the prior state. They were carried to power by mass movement, which saw in them, and which described them, and which they described themselves as incarnations, representatives, and spokespersons for the mass movement. They appropriated the language of the mass movement, the language of popular democracy, the language of nationalization. They used, and Chavez is the absolute past master of this, of employing both the language and the imaginary and the symbolism of the popular movements to identify himself with them and to create an identity between them. And yet, now each of these governments, and in a very brief period, because Jeff's right to see 2000, I want to go back before 2000 just briefly in a minute, but really if we take 2000 as a starting point of this extraordinary upsurge, this insurrectionary process, we are now in 2012, and those who were carried to power by the insurrectionary process have now turned against those who carried them into power and are enacting against them and using against them instruments of repression and control, denunciation, the language of denouncing as counter-revolutionary, for example, in Venezuela, is regularly employed, for example, to denounce groups of workers pressing for wage demands. The underground workers in Caracas were denounced as counter-revolutionary because they were making wage demands, and so on. So what we have then is, in this short period, a process of if you like, what we see as radical popular democracy has now reverted into something very different. And I think what I want to do is try and very briefly, it has to be very briefly, describe what this actually means. When Jeff talks about reconstituted neoliberalism, I think we should just try to describe what that is in the briefest terms. And to describe what it is to say, for example, that if you look at a map of the Amazon region of Ecuador, to take one example, every square inch of it, with the exception of one small area, which has become the object of a great movement of Hollywood film producers and stars to save it, which is the Yasuni National Park. Every other inch of the Ecuadorian Amazon is already conceded to a battery of mining and oil companies, foreign mining and oil companies, some American, mostly Canadian, though I'm beginning to realize that many of the Canadian enterprises have an inexplicably large number of people with Chinese names on their executive boards. One such being Corriente Resources, which I looked up and discovered that all the members of the executive board were Chinese. In other words, it's been bought by China. The whole region is conceded to oil and mining concerns. The same is true in Peru, where the Yanacocha mine, the gold mine, the Conga mine, which is owned by a Canadian company called Glenmore, is now the central symbolic representation of the hundreds of struggles which are going on all over Peru, of communities defending themselves against the intrusion and the eruption of mining and oil companies, the destruction of their resources, the theft of their land. And the important thing is to understand it as being about land, the taking of their land and so on. Struggles all over the country under a president who identified himself, at least briefly, Humala, as a member of this kind of Bolivarian alliance. So really, the subject of the process, as Garcia Linera describes it, as Chavez describes it, as Morales describes it, as Correa describes it, is no longer the people in rebellion. The subject of the new process is the new state. And the people in rebellion are being called upon to accept the leadership of and subordinate themselves to the new state. And this is done in many ways, partly by repression, partly by incorporation. If as I would always tend to do, I would see the Bolivarian Revolution, that is the entry of the masses of ordinary Bolivians onto the historical stage. I wouldn't date it from the election of Chavez at the end of 1998, but I would date it from April 2002, when the right mounted a coup against Chavez, took him away, and the masses of Venezuela occupied the country, seized the country, surrounded the presidential palace, and announced that they would not move until Chavez was returned. That was the point at which the Bolivarian Revolution began. And for a couple of years, it seemed in Venezuela as if if you like, the logic and the impulse from below would then begin for the first time to shape the Venezuelan state. And that was expressed in things called the missions, which were largely popular, really in many cases welfare programs, but the key thing about them was that they were apparently under community and democratic control. They were driven from below. Yet within less than 2 years, those were reincorporated into a largely unchanged and untransformed state. Their leadership's taken in. Now most of them are in the ministries here and there. They're leading functionaries. They're in the oil corporation and elsewhere. And they were, in a sense, demobilized and emasculated and reincorporated into the state. That's the critical process, I think. And then from 2006 onwards, I think a very important moment for me is 2006, equivalent in Bolivia as well, and in Ecuador, with the election of these new governments, and in the case of Venezuela, the re-election of Chavez, but then the creation of an instrument of power, an instrument of political control, whose significance I think only began to emerge later. He created the United Socialist Party of Venezuela. It was modeled directly on the Cuban state, and shaped and written by Cuban advisors. I can provide the evidence if you need it. But what was interesting about it, of course, Chavez's kind of extraordinary capacity to ride two horses at once allowed him to turn to the people and say, this organization is a mass organization of the people, join it. And the people took it seriously, and 6 million people joined in less than a month, which I think by any criterion probably constitutes a mass party. However, mass party though it was, the immediate subsequent announcement was that the constitution and the program of the party would be written by 4 people named by Chavez, and who were the controlling instruments of the new party. So they were drawn in, but the promise of democratic control, of open debate and discussion was simply abandoned in a matter of weeks. That's the reality. In other words, the initiative was taken from the popular movement by the instrument of the creation of a new state. And that's how I would see the MAS. I think it's very important the way that Jeff described MAS in Bolivia. It was not an organization emerging out of and growing with and through the mass movement, but an instrument that was largely marginal to the mass movement, and which came in later to provide, if you like, a program for the transformation of the state, but which did not reflect the logic or the characteristics of the movement that had brought them there in the first place. They emerged as you put it, negotiators, mediating between the state and the movement. And so did the PSUV. Because of its rhetoric, because of Chavez's extraordinary personality and his capacity to speak to masses, which is undeniable, that was kind of obscured. And it was doubly obscured because all his admirers abroad, from Tariq Ali onwards, celebrated this as a new mass party. And largely they celebrated it in some very expensive hotels in Caracas. But anyway, I'm just being nasty and bitter. Anyway, that moment to me is a critical crossroads when we're discussing the project that was built as of then and its relationship with the living movement that had made the new project possible. The new project, I think, was the constitution, the construction of a new nation state, whose role would be that of this to govern and run the process of accumulation, to renegotiate the terms of the relationship with each of the states and the world market, demanding as the payment for that renegotiation a higher level of taxes, of royalties and so on, which would enable some of the basic welfare demands of the movements that have risen up to be answered. So the Venezuelan Oil Corporation provided a large fund which paid for the housing programs, the health programs, and the education programs. The same was true in Bolivia, the same was true in Ecuador. What was taken back was then used to provide basic welfare programs and to try and lift people back to something like the standard of living they might have aspired to or might even have had in the middle 1980s. But the critical thing is this political moment when it is possible for the governors of the new state to reconstitute that project, to represent it as the logical outcome and expression of the movements of rebellion, of the people in rebellion that had brought them to power. And yet, if we look at those movements and look, if you like, at the nascent forms of power that express themselves in the course of those movements, they are far, far more radical and profoundly different. If we look, for example, at in Venezuela, though they were created from above, nevertheless there were things called the communal commands. In Ecuador, from 1990 onwards, the movement was extraordinarily radical and created all sorts of forms of, if you like, democratic grassroots power. And perhaps the most radical of all were the popular assemblies or the open cabildos of Bolivia. If they were the embryo of a project for power, then the project for power was radically different from the reconstitution of the bourgeois state. It was something profoundly different. It was democratic, it was grassroots, it was anti-capitalist, and in every sense, that was if you like, the model of power that these movements set out in their practice. But politically, that practice was appropriated and redefined, so that 6 years later, we now find these states engaged in vigorous negotiation with world capital, with China, with Iran, yes, separating themselves from their exclusive relationship with the United States to seek out other relationships, but selling the land, selling their resources, and recommitting themselves to a program of economic development based upon the extraction of raw materials and governed largely by foreign capital in Bolivia, Brazilian capital, in Peru and Ecuador. It is Chinese and Canadian capital, international capital, which is reshaping the Ecuadorian economy. And those who oppose it are now denounced by the president, who was the president of the people, or as he described himself, of the civic rebellion, the civic revolution, now denouncing them as terrorists and counter-revolutionaries. If that was possible, I think, because our interest is political, it's important just to take a couple of minutes to go back and ask why this was possible. And I think it was possible. We talked a little bit about this in other contexts yesterday. The 1990s, the struggle of the 1990s, in extremely disadvantageous conditions, but above all, in a political vacuum caused by the collapse of Stalinism, by the collapse of social democratic alternatives, represented probably most directly by the Venezuelan Punto Fijo project, a kind of social democratic structure which collapsed in corruption and dishonesty and repression with the Caracazo, the great rising of the people of Caracas in 1989. That was no longer alternative. That was no longer a model. The intervention of the NGOs, the decomposition of the state very rapidly in what was supposed to be the transition to democracy, which turned out to be the transition to neoliberalism, in Latin America. As they decomposed, the NGOs assumed a role in trying to provide provide for some of the needs that the state would otherwise have had to provide for: health, housing, land reform, and so on. And this is the period when, if you like, the symbol of those times, the subject of those times was the Zapatista national liberation movement, the first explicit rebellion against neoliberalism. But they came to occupy a key political role in the international debate in Latin America with their slogan, as constituted by Subcomandante Marcos and John Holloway, which was how to change the world without taking power. And I think it's very, very important for us to recognize the explicit renunciation of the search for a model of power, for the question of addressing the state, which is embedded in the rise of those movements. And the result is that the rebellions are extraordinarily creative, heroic, imaginative, but they have no central project for power. They have no central project for seizing control of the power. The influence, to my mind, the influence of Holloway on the one hand, and of Carlton Negri on the other, whose impact in Latin America you can find in Linera's book. He quotes them very approvingly in order to explain that, in a sense, we're not dealing with classes anymore, but with multitudes who shift and change through time and according to context. In other words, the new state becomes the political substitute of the movement. The subject of the rebellion, the subject of history until 2005-6 is the people in arms, the people in rebellion. The subject from 2006 onwards are those who run and administer the new state, with a project and a model which is absolutely clearly of reintegration into neoliberalism. Now, if that's the case, we either say, well, hey, that's as far as you can go, and Linera and the others will answer and say, well, but it is a new kind of state. It's born out of the new constitutions. It's plurinational. Every single one of these constitutions is plurinational. Well, they're plurinational, culturally speaking, they're acknowledgements of the rights of indigenous peoples and so on. But they are not plural in the sense that there are multiple centers of power. They are not plural in the sense that they represent decision-making process which engage and integrate people at the grassroots, those who made the rebellion, not at all. And the evidence is there in a constitution in Ecuador, which just look at a picture of the Ecuadorian parliament. It's glorious. It is a multiplicity and diversity of costume and of colour and of language. It's the world as we would like to see it. That's the assembly. But it's not reflected in the laws, the decrees, or the conduct of the state, which sees their intervention beyond the cultural as a disturbance and as an interference. So where does that leave us politically? What challenge does that lay down for us in this discussion? Well, we can either take the line, which I'm afraid that's how I read Federico Fuentes and others, which is the best we can do. Let's hang on to what we have, and let's hope we can make improvements here and there. But really, beyond this model, there is nothing. But beyond this model, there is something. There is the people in rebellion and the forms of government and power that those struggles threw up. Sadly, they've been very quickly and very easily forgotten. And I think part of our task is to insist on remembering them, insist on understanding them as representing the logic of the movements that grew up in the struggle against neoliberalism, the demands for the kind of society that was demanded, albeit implicitly, because of the absence really of a kind of central column of political argument which would shape them into a political project alternative to the reconstitution of the state. That didn't happen, and really, it's impossible to avoid the sense of kind of confusion and demoralization among many of the very best fighters. We were talking earlier about Michael Roland Dennis. Some of you might remember from Marxism 3 years ago, and he was, he is quite a very particular kind of figure, and he's an autonomist and an anarchist, but he represents and speaks at least with the voice of many of those movements from below. But they are dispersed, they are demoralized, and they're disorientated because the people who led them, the people who speak their language, have now turned against them and demanded that they restrict their activities and that they renounce their leadership of the process and abandon it to those who are in a state which they now see, like Tipnis, like the Ecuadorian oil fields, like Chavez himself, delivering their state back to other enemies who look staggeringly similar to the enemies against whom they fought for 20 years. One last note then, to finish on. It may seem that, that I shouldn't include Chavez and the Bolivarian Revolution in this picture. Surely it's different. Well, you may have noticed, and there's not time to go into it at length, but just it's important to mention, you may have noticed just very recently a peace agreement was reached between the FARC and the Colombian government. This was brokered by Chavez. It's a peace agreement which, on the face of it, might look like like another Good Friday agreement. But if you look at it carefully, Santos, number one, was the Minister of Defense during the worst period of repression under the corrupt government of Uribe. He was the Minister of Defense, managing, coordinating, and deepening the process of repression across Colombia. If he has now reached agreement with Chavez, it is not because he has had a change of heart, nor a crisis of conscience. It's for two quite different reasons. Number one, that there is a hugely important project to build a gas pipeline through Colombian and Venezuelan territory and to feed America and Europe. And the agreement also includes an agreement about the gas pipeline. Secondly, the Colombian project is a project, 40% of Colombian territory is now conceded in principle to mining and oil companies. For that to be possible to carry through, together with the agricultural reorganization, the building of a new export agriculture in Colombia, requires two things: relative social peace and the large-scale dispossession of the peasantry so that the lands can be given over to the production of soya, sugarcane for bioethanol, and flowers. And that will only be achieved as a result of this peace agreement, because the FARC was largely based in those areas and as it emerged as peasant defense organizations. Now, Chavez has not colluded in this blindly or through ignorance, but because his project is one which is not a socialist project. He called it socialism for the 21st century. If this is socialism for the 21st century, then I think we need a very severe rethink about what we mean about socialism. The task for us, though, is not simply to describe and denounce and sit back, but to recognize that the contradictions and the conflicts remain, that there is a living population there with a very recent, vibrant and lived experience of struggle, that is a fertile ground into which the ideas of revolutionary socialism can be sown, especially since they can be identified with the real forms and the real practices of that struggle. But for that to happen requires engagement, not standing aside with a formula waiting for them to come to us, but engagement with those struggles, however contradictory or partial they may be, engagement with them, and engagement which would then give us the authority and the right to embark upon the political debate which can reopen and take back the project for socialist transformation.